I'm Roy Kamphausen, President of MBR. Thank you for joining today's discussion, the first in a series that will continue over the next 2 days on the topic of building sustainable energy transitions. We hope you'll be able to join us again tomorrow and Thursday as well. This week's events are an important part of a project developed from a multi-year cooperative agreement between MBR and the State Department's Bureau of Energy Resources. Through a series of workshops, commissioned research, and the establishment of a fellowship program, this project aims to identify opportunities and outline recommendations for cooperation between the United States and its partners across the Indo-Pacific on energy security, access, and markets. This conference builds on last summer's workshops and serves as the culminating event for our inaugural class of program fellows. We're excited to have all 5 fellows from the class of 2020-21 speaking this week. My colleague Mike Herberg will introduce 2 of the fellows as panelists a little later in the program today. And stay tuned, we'll be announcing the full slate of new fellows for 2021-22 in coming days. Before introducing today's keynote speaker, I'd like to thank the members of MBR's team who have made today's event possible. You've met Audrey Mossberger, our Director of Events, Ashley Johnson, who leads our Energy and Environmental Affairs team, and her colleagues Tom Lutkin and Micah Sindelar. We're also honored to welcome back Ambassador Virginia Palmer today, Acting Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Energy Resources. We were so pleased to feature Ambassador Palmer at our workshop last summer, and her insightful comments then planted the seeds for our discussions this week, ranging from critical minerals and supply chains to the role of the United States in energy development across the Indo-Pacific. A lot has changed in the United States and across the world since last August, so we're very much looking forward to once again hearing from her on these topics. A bit on her background: Ambassador Virginia Palmer became Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Energy Resources on November 4th, 2019, and became Acting Assistant Secretary of State for ENR at the beginning of the Biden administration in January 2021. Her distinguished Foreign Service career has her at the rank of Minister Counselor. She's most recently served as the Deputy Commandant and International Affairs Advisor at the Dwight D. Eisenhower School for National Security and Resource Strategy. She's also served as the United States Ambassador to the Republic of Malawi from 2015 to 2019. Earlier, she was Deputy Chief of Mission and Charge d'Affaires at the U.S. Embassy in South Africa from 2011 to 2014, and she had the same jobs, DCM and Charge d'Affaires, at the U.S. Embassy in Vietnam from 2008 to 2011. As you can tell, it's been quite a distinguished career, and that's just the last decade of it. Ambassador Palmer is a graduate of Georgetown and University of Virginia. She speaks Chinese and French. We're so delighted to have you back, Ambassador Palmer. Virginia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Roy. I'm glad to see you again and look forward to the day we can do it again in person. I'm also really delighted to be here to celebrate the year that the Asia Edge Fellows have had and to discuss these important issues. As you note, it's a very interesting time, I think, to be discussing the clean energy transition and energy sustainability and security, particularly in the Asia Pacific region. I'm also want to just thank you very sincerely for your partnership. We really value the research that NBR does, and these meetings are extremely valuable. And I know that the fellows are producing important work and will go back to their home countries and share insights that they've gleaned this year. I say go back. I also need to thank them for their flexibility in doing all of this virtually this year. But I think that the ties that we've built, even virtually, can be continued. We're in a period of unprecedented energy transformations, both in terms of energy supply and energy demand. And as this group well understands, the Indo-Pacific region is projected to represent 2/3 of global energy demand growth through 2040. This increased demand will support economic growth throughout the region and a vibrant young population that demands affordable, reliable, and increasingly demands clean energy. The region also consumes a majority of the world's coal power, however, so there's a contradiction inherent in all of this. Coal consumption in Southeast Asia has more than doubled in the last decade, and China alone produces half of the world's coal power annually. Without a forceful commitment to change, that trend is projected to continue. The IEA estimates that the Indo-Pacific needs more than $1 trillion in investments annually to meet this projected demand. And it's important that these investments help the world to meet the climate change. Policymakers and energy professionals in the Indo-Pacific and across the world face the extraordinary challenge of meeting surging demand while simultaneously reducing emissions and combating the climate crisis. It's a tall order. And how countries choose to meet this challenge will vary depending on the specific circumstances in each country, what resources they have, but we want decarbonization to be a priority. We stand ready to work with our allies and partners on a three-pillared approach. Decarbonization is the first and arguably the most important, but energy security and energy access, energy justice, crucial to development, remain incredibly important and need to be balanced against the goals of decarbonization. I don't think that in any circumstance they need to be mutually exclusive. I hope that decarbonization can be additive and we can find a path that leads us towards clean energy while ensuring that we have access to reliable, affordable energy. Asia Edge, or enhancing development and growth through energy, bolsters our partners' energy security, supports sustainable development goals, and advances decarbonization in the Indo-Pacific. We work, and I've talked about this at the last meeting, on market integration, harmonization of regulation, and improvement generally of investment conditions. That's to create conditions so that the private sector will invest in the energy infrastructure that's required, because we can't meet that $1 trillion demand without the private sector. Governments alone can't do that. We also work on energy efficiency and renewable integration into power grids. Asia Edge has increased its focus on the clean energy transition and decarbonization in line with the United States' re-entry into the Paris Agreement and the White House's focus on tackling the climate crisis. I'd like to give just a few examples of how we're doing that. At the April 16th U.S.-Japan summit between President Biden and Prime Minister Suga, we launched the U.S.-Japan, or the Japan-U.S. Clean Energy Partnership. It was previously the Japan-U.S. Strategic Energy Partnership. Now it has a C, but it still is JUSIP, to support partners in the Indo-Pacific to accelerate their decarbonization while achieving energy security and sustainable growth by deploying clean, affordable, and secure energy technologies. In India, the Flexible Resources Initiative under the U.S.-India Clean Energy Finance Task Force advances cost-effective strategies to enhance the flexibility of India's power system as renewables increasingly penetrate India's grid. FREE provides a least cost, operationally feasible investment pathway that achieved Prime Minister Modi's announced target of 450 gigawatts of installed renewable energy capacity by 2030. There's a lot of work with natural gas that's involved in that. And that's a challenge because we need to view gas as a transition fuel, but ensure that it doesn't result in stranded assets or over-reliance on hydrocarbons. In Vietnam, ENR is helping integrate more than 16 gigawatts of new solar generation onto the grid. In Thailand, we're supporting a new renewable energy forecasting center to help the electric utility prepare for increasing levels of variable renewable energy generation, as well as support peer-to-peer trading of small-scale renewable energy producers. They're meeting for the first time tonight. In South Asia, we support government efforts in Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka to scale up renewable energy generation and to explore innovative financing options for renewables projects. We're also looking at cross-border power trade, which is going to be essential to having a systemic approach to these issues. All of this work, our diplomatic engagement, technical assistance, and private sector advocacy supports the broad goal of growing access to affordable, reliable, diverse, and clean energy in the region. I'd like to take just a few minutes to talk about ERGI and clean energy minerals. Roy talked about this at the top. There's been an explosion in demand for these minerals as we adopt more clean energy technologies. And there's not much attention paid to the minerals required to produce them, and also the conditions under which those minerals are produced. China controls about 85% of that supply chain. And COVID, I think, made countries all over the world aware of vulnerabilities in supply chains when they're dominated by a single region. That dominance is partly the result of opacity in Chinese environmental laws and the fact that there's a lot of processing going on in China as a result. But it's also the result of growing Chinese investment in mining of these minerals throughout the world. The World Bank recently published an exceptional paper that describes raw materials demand for different renewable deployment scenarios. It concludes that the production of several clean energy related minerals would need to increase by more than 500% by 2050. And the IEA just released a new critical mineral report today, in fact, that is actually quite comprehensive and excellent. To ensure the security of energy mineral supply chains and the responsible sourcing of energy minerals with respect to environmental sustainability and human rights of the communities surrounding these mines, the United States, Botswana, Peru, Canada, and Australia founded the Energy Resources Governance Initiative. ERGI is designed to promote the sound mining sector governance and resilient energy mineral supply chains. And through this initiative, my office engages countries to advance governance principles, share best practices, and encourage a level playing field for energy mineral investment. There's an ERGI toolkit that's available to governments and, frankly, anybody who wants to have a look that provides decision trees about the kinds of issues that need to be considered as you think about the issues on above ground governance of this sector. We're eager to partner with countries in the Indo-Pacific region under ERGI to share best practices and create a demand signal where electric vehicle and battery storage companies and consumers demand products that are made with responsibly sourced minerals that are essential for the world to face an existential threat of climate change and work together toward net zero emissions. So it's a kind of a two-part equation. We work on ERGI government to government to improve these governance regimes, and then work with the private sector to generate a demand signal from companies that they want minerals that are sustainably sourced, and that there will be something in it for governments that do the right thing and improve the sustainability of their supply chains and their governance of the mining sector. I'm pleased that the United States has spent about $10.5 million on capacity building. We're just starting a new program in Indonesia with their nickel mining and governance of that sector. And the Australian government announced at the climate summit on Earth Day that they will put 775,000 US dollars or million Australian dollars toward ERGI, primarily to the ERGI Academy, which will bring people from this sector to Nevada to look at US and other international mining practices, tour some mines, and share best practices. So I think there are exciting things happening there and all across the region. So I am once again really delighted to be here, and thank you again for your partnership, Roy and friends at NBR, and I look forward to hearing some of your deliberations and hearing the conclusions of the workshop as you get into these issues. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ambassador Palmer, and it's always a treat to see you. As you say, it'll be a delight when we get to see each other and co-host a workshop together in person, hopefully soon. But you've given us a great foundation on which to start this conference, and so now let me turn to Ashley Johnson, NBR Director of Energy and Environmental Affairs Group, to set the scene for our first panel. So over to you, Ashley.
Thank you so much, Roy, and many thanks again to you, Ambassador Palmer, for joining us. There's a lot of interesting content that you have laid out there, and I know we'll discuss some of those things today and over the course of the next few days. So again, thank you very much, and we look forward to continue examining and seeing where some of those new initiatives might be going. To echo Roy's earlier comments, thank you all for joining us today, and welcome to this first session. We're really delighted to have you join us as we have an excellent group of speakers over the next 2 days, and I look forward to learning from them and hearing your questions as well. I'm now delighted to hand over the reins today to today's moderator, Mikkal Herberg. Mike is a senior advisor to MBR and the research director of our energy security program, as well as a senior lecturer at the University of California, San Diego. Now, Mike, since I know we want to get into these topics, I will just turn the reins over to you. Muted. Mike, you're still muted.
Mike, I'm not sure if you can hear us, but you're still muted. There you go.
It's the bane of the Zooming age, isn't it? Let me start again. Thank you and welcome everybody. I think we've got a great panel today, and I know we've got more over the next couple of days. So I'm looking forward to it. Let me just provide a few comments of context for the panel, some broad contextual remarks. Developing Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia faced enormously challenging energy choices and challenges over the next 2 decades. I tend to think of it as kind of the energy trilemma that the region's facing. I think a lot of policymakers and energy folks in the US and Europe don't really understand the kind of challenges that these countries face. That's been entirely, very different from the kind of challenges that Europe faces, the US faces in terms of its energy choices. So I think it's important to understand the context for this region. Energy and electricity demand are booming. Now, this is notwithstanding the pandemic, of course. But even if you revert to a lower base effect, this is a region where energy and electricity demand is booming. Energy and electricity are critical to rapid economic growth, to raising standards of living, to reducing poverty, to expanding energy access. So the security, and particularly of electricity supply, is a critical strategic national issue for all of these countries in the region. And I think people in the West often don't understand that that security of electricity supply is such a critical issue. Second, affordability of energy supplies and electricity. These are poor countries. They cannot afford the same scale of prices that many rich countries can. Affordability is an enormously important issue. They can't afford high, volatile energy and electricity prices. It's enormous hardships on these populations and get in the way of raising standards of living. But of course, also the third element, the leg of the trilemma, is this transition to a cleaner energy mix and a more sustainable energy mix. We all know about air pollution, the health effects of the disastrous air pollution that the region experiences, and also obviously climate change and all the issues that go with that. So that search for a more sustainable energy mix, at the same time as meeting this booming energy and electricity demand and security of supply at the same time, creates very, very difficult trade-offs, I think, for the region in terms of energy policy. And finally, overlay the geopolitics in the region. This overlay of US-China competition for influence and power in the region, Japan's role, Australia, other partners to the US in these various energy programs, the EDGE program, and others. So you have this overlay of the China BRI programs, the US Free and Open Indo-Pacific alliances and group. So on top of the complexity of the energy challenges, you have this competition for influence in a geopolitical overlay. All of this, I think, creates some very difficult practical energy choices for policymakers. What's the role of coal? How do you slow the use of coal in the region? This is the region we all know has been on a trajectory to use a lot more coal in the future. So how do you prevent coal from becoming or remaining the default fuel in electricity? Because that's where we are today. And of course, China's companies, state companies, are perfectly happy to keep building coal-fired power plants in the region where there's demand for those coal-fired power plants. So cheap, abundant, secure, but how do you knock coal out of that default fuel role? What's the role of gas and LNG? Can policymakers in these 4 countries that rely on LNG and gas to be an affordable electricity generation supply over the long term? And we had extraordinarily low LNG prices, 12, 14 months ago. But over the winter, we had a cold winter, supply problems and other things. We had the highest LNG prices that we've had ever for a short period of time this past winter. That can't possibly inspire confidence among policymakers in the region that LNG is going to be a long-term affordable supply. So I think the issue of how do you make gas a transition fuel, a bridge fuel, and LNG, but also make it fit into these issues of affordability for the region? Or should you just skip LNG and go to renewable? And I think that's the position of many people who feel you need to move fossil fuels out completely rapidly. Then, of course, the role of renewables, the complexity of incorporating renewables into the grid, intermittency, the grid updating and investments that have to be made to be able to use renewables effectively, increasingly low cost, but a more complex process than just building another coal-fired power plant. So how do you do that? And then you've got hydro, particularly in the Mekong region, hydro being a key issue. Low carbon, but with lots of externalities and collateral issues, upstream, downstream, fisheries, farming, geopolitics of the control of the rivers. So those are, I think, just some practical sets of choices, not just what do policymakers do, but these are real hard choices that policymakers have to make. And then what's the role of EDGE, Blue Dot Network, Build, all these programs that the ambassador just outlined? How can they be made the most effective for us to get the most bang for our buck in terms of the investments that we make, and in particular, how to mobilize private capital on the scale that's needed? Because this can't be done with state funds. This has to be largely done with private capital. There's plenty of private capital out there. There's, the world's awash in funds and pension funds and others looking for places to park capital. So how do you match those two things up? So I think that's what I'd like to hopefully get out of the next couple of days in this panel. In terms of the panel, let me just briefly introduce our panel in the order that they will speak. Jane Nakano from the Center for Strategic International Studies, someone that almost needs no introduction at this stage. She's really been one of the really important researchers on energy in Asia for quite a long time. So Jane will start off. Secondly, Huong from the Australia Strategic Policy Institute. She does research on Southeast Asia's relations with the great powers and the interconnection between energy and national security in the region, the competition between China and Japan. So interesting, I'm sure, comments Huong will be able to make second. Then third, we have Mandira ADHIKARI, excuse me, and she is with the He's with the Nepal Electricity Authority, and interestingly is involved in signing power purchase agreements with independent power producers, monitoring hydropower projects. So really right in the gears of the kinds of decisions, policy choices that we're talking about here. And finally, Toru KUBO from the Asian Development Bank, Director of the Southeast Asia Energy Division. I believe, have some comments about their approach to coal investments in the future and the bank's approach to energy choices in the region. So interesting group, covers a lot of range. And so with that, I will turn the floor over to Jane.
Thank you very much, Mike, for an extremely generous introduction. And it's really my honor to follow you, and also Ambassador Palmer's keynote. I think some of the comments that I wanted to offer today really underscore many of the themes that the ambassador already highlighted. But I think the way that I like to organize is that there are three sort of key factors that I like our U.S. partners in the region to really watch closely as sort of important factors that shape the Biden administration's energy engagement in the Indo-Pacific region. These three are climate change, obviously, the centrality of this issue to the administration, but then also the international partnerships being a very important way for the administration to engage partners, really both multilateral but also bilateral partnerships. And then, of course, the U.S.-China rivalry, how that may also affect the U.S. engagement in the region. So the Biden administration has declared climate change to be a crisis, and that has put climate crisis at the center of the U.S. foreign policy and national security. For example, we've already heard from Secretary of State Tony Blinken that State Department would take into account how every bilateral and multilateral engagement and every policy decision will impact U.S. goal, putting the world on a safer, more sustainable path. So in many ways, it's climate change is just it's not just the U.S. interest. It's something that U.S. sees as something that the U.S. can contribute for really the benefit of our partners and allies, and quite frankly, everyone, because climate will be multiplying a lot of traditional security issues, but also creating some of the new security issues, such as this the pandemic that we're still living through. This centrality of climate change and also this pronounced preference for international partnerships have already begun shaping the Biden administration's energy engagement in the region. We've already seen the Biden administration put the United States back in the Paris Climate Agreement. But then also, as the ambassador noted, there have been some international partnerships that the United States has launched, including with Japan, but then also with India, that will look at both clean energy and also finance issues, with one of the largest growing economies with significant regional security implications to the United States. And also during this time, we saw Special Presidential Climate Envoy John Kerry, Secretary Kerry, meet his counterpart, Xie Zhenhua, and strike this joint statement on climate crisis. In many ways, I think it reflected how China is, in my view, I think, open to how to sort of cooperate or engage with the United States and be cooperative where it can, very much the sort of formula that the administration articulated earlier on. And moreover, the Biden administration announced a climate finance plan in late April to scale up the U.S. Public climate finance and also mobilize private finance internationally. As Mike has noted as well, government alone cannot do this. We really need to unlock private finance as well in order to really facilitate this energy transition. And on the occasion of the Leaders Summit on Climate on April 22nd and 23rd, the administration announced the intent to double the level of annual climate finance to developing countries by 2024. The level, that increase will be against the spending level during the second half of the Obama administration, after the level dropped sharply during the Trump administration years. And also, the White House instructed federal agencies to prioritize climate in public investments and also enhance technical assistance. For example, the U.S. Development Finance Corporation now aims to achieve a net zero investment portfolio by 2040 and increase its climate-related investments beginning in fiscal year 2023, where at least 1/3 of its new investments are going to be linked to addressing the climate crisis. We've also seen how the Ex-Im Bank, Export-Import Bank of the United States, is to significantly increase support for U.S. exports that are, including renewable energy, energy efficiency, and energy storage type exports. Another key administration goal is to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies at home, but then also to end international financing of carbon intensive fossil fuel based energy. And that portion is included in a climate finance plan that was unveiled in late April. And under that plan, the administration instructs federal agencies to begin concrete work on this front. Here, I wanted to know how the primary target is not just necessarily sort of coal. I think there's this growing debate on the role of natural gas in the U.S. domestic energy system due to the emissions implications of natural gas use, ranging from its production, but then also transport and domestic consumption, and also sort of the implications of export. Obviously, it's not a policy per se, but there is this growing sort of a debate and also scrutiny in the U.S. in general, including a lot of NGOs as well as industry partners and of course policymakers in Washington. And in particular, the U.S. methane emissions is one of the key challenges to the Biden administration's vision to cut the greenhouse gas emissions by half by 2030 and to achieve a net zero economy by 2050. Just last week, we saw the U.S. Senate vote to reverse the Trump administration's step to weaken methane emissions regulations from oil and gas fields. This is an area which I think warrants close attention because I think in the past 4 years and perhaps even beyond, the last 4 years, we saw natural gas play a pretty significant part of a U.S. energy engagement with Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific partner governments. But now I think we're starting to see much limited role given to natural gas and certainly U.S. Natural gas export as the administration speaks to its counterparts from the region. And so this is quite a sort of a reversal in my view. And then, so these are just some of the key sort of agenda that the Biden administration has. But of course, these have very strong resonance to this region. As the ambassador already highlighted, there are a lot of important sort of components to the energy engagement. It's also sort of energy access. But in many ways, some of these sort of agenda really, I think, are starting to affect how some of the key partners in the region are starting to look at both opportunities and perhaps challenges. The region is home to both top global importers of LNG, including Japan, Korea, China, India, but then also exporters like Australia, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the US. Also, some of the major coal users and producers, such as Australia and China and India. And in many ways, how in the past, several decades, but especially in recent years, the regional energy transition conversation has been evolving around sort of the initiatives to facilitate the field switch away from coal to natural gas. But right at the moment, I think there is much greater emphasis on perhaps even sort of speeding up that transition beyond natural gas. It's definitely something that we really should pay a lot of attention to. And and also quickly, I wanted to know about how this rising U.S.-China rivalry may affect the regional energy engagement. Again, in the words of Secretary Blinken, managing relationship with China is the biggest geopolitical test of the 21st century. China is a major player in global energy system, as we know. It's one of the major oil and gas importers. But aside from being, sort of a major hydrocarbon consumer, China is also a major investor in clean energy sources and also leading manufacturer of clean energy technology components today. And sorry to be a little redundant here, but as the ambassador already noted, I mean, China does have sort of a very strong position along these clean energy technology and also component minerals. And this is a extremely important point to make, because as the United States tries to really enhance its engagement in the region and work with the partners, it's not just the hydrocarbon export and the role or our ability to perhaps alleviate some of the import dependence concerns, and so the region's import dependence concerns on other regional other exporters in the world, for example, dependence on let's say like Middle East, but it's also what we might be able to start offering to the region. China currently has about 90% of the global solar PV wafer manufacturing capacity. Also, it has a commanding position along EV battery cell manufacturing supply chains. But the administration is starting to take a very close look at the supply chains, the health of the U.S. supply chains for high capacity batteries, including those for EV. And also there's a lot of focus on the effort to revitalize the U.S. manufacturing base, including the clean energy manufacturing. And as these efforts progress, I think it could really, to some extent, turn this U.S.-China rivalry into something that could be a benefit, sort of a healthy rivalry that could perhaps further reduce the cost of these clean energy sources and options for the regional partners, including Southeast Asia, not just Northeast Asia and South Asia, and then offer competitive alternatives to energy projects that the Beijing promotes under the Belt and Road Initiative, for example. So this greater competition, when it's done by taking into account sound ESG standards, environment, social, and governance standards. Again, this is also a theme that the ambassador already highlighted. There's the energy resource governance initiative that the State Department has been leading. But all these things really have to be done together, and together with making many of these cleaner energy projects and options, financially stable. I think the United States can play a bigger role in helping the region, including Southeast Asia, but then also the Pacific Islands, be able to attract more capital. Because the region has really undermet energy infrastructure needs. In short, I think at the moment, I'm really looking forward to seeing how this administration will advance its vision, but then also start perhaps working with its partners to operationalize some of these initiatives that have been announced. So I think there's quite a bit that warrant close attention in months and years to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane. That was terrific. Let's turn over Huong to for your remarks. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to see some of the familiar faces and also see new faces in the field. I'm very pleased to be with you, although virtually. So my role in this conference is also to present a little bit of more political background, political context of this great power competition, and how does that particularly is reflected in Southeast Asia. I think that's quite an important development that we've had since President Biden came to the office. And I think in general, the regional mood, especially in Southeast Asia, has also changed. So before Biden, I think under President Trump, the shaping great power competition between the US and China had, caused a lot of tension, maybe even friction, and then the regional responses were quite alerted to the whole range of competition between US and China. And really, the agenda of climate and energy has been to some degree set aside because of really overwhelming, geopolitical aspect of great power competition. Now in 2021, it's really where it's even still we have COVID going on. I think there's a lot of hope. I think the regional views on Biden and Biden administration have been quite hopeful. And if there's one key word so far, it would be climate change for 2021, because coming back to the global agenda, within the first 100 days, Biden had this special summit in which 3 of Southeast Asian countries also attended. So I think it's making really a comeback as a priority, as my co-panelists mentioned. And the US not only is joining a multilateral agenda and UN and the Paris Agreement and making own individual commitment, but it's trying to bring everyone along as well. And that is certainly seen in Australia as well. And I think before I go into the individual Southeast Asian countries' strategy about climate and energy plans, I just wanted to highlight that China's been shaping its influence in infrastructure, which includes energy infrastructure in the region for a long time. Because of the Trump administration, less attention to those issues, I think there is a lot that US needs to catch up, particularly in this region make up for the past 5 years, So mentioned earlier Belt and Road Initiative. It's a massive infrastructure investment project that initially also in very beginning started from Southeast Asia, started from those pipeline and either a pipeline and construction and transporting energy. So it's not very far off. I think how the huge Belt and Road Initiative is being implemented and carry on will really determine the standard and the landscape of energy and renewables and sustainability in the region. My research focused mainly on Mekong, and there we could talk about some attempts to transfer from hydro power to other more sustainable and safer energy. But other than that, China has had a lot of criticism in how it implements the Belt and Road infrastructure project across the world. And I think being responsive, at least politically responsive to that criticism, at its second Belt and Road Initiative Summit, President Xi Jinping committed to more green energy, sustainable infrastructure. How that really will, implement is another thing. But at least on the political level, I think China is also showing its adaptiveness to the issue. Now, the issue of climate, in one of the speakers said it's central now. It's centrality of climate. I think it's also quite politicized in many ways. It has been here in Australia for sure, but in Southeast Asia is one of the most vulnerable regions to the climate. And 2020 was not the only year of pandemic. It was also one of the hottest year in the history. We had wildfires, even in Australia, we had drought, flood, and other severe climate conditions. And Southeast Asia's really, climate change will affect its economic, political, and social stability of Southeast Asia. Those are the hazards that will have long-term repercussions, and there are different studies and reports showing the extent and the percentage of Southeast Asian average yearly GDP that not mitigated climate changes can cause. It ranges anywhere between 8% to 13% of GDP annually of those countries, just to cope with the fallout of severe climate changes, for example. And those are countries that have huge populations. So the energy and the energy demand would only, and if it's not sustainable, will only have knock-off effect on that. Now, I also want to bring back the issue of COVID, because COVID-induced crisis in the region, particularly in the developing parts of Southeast Asia in particular, is also posing some challenges to countries' climate goals and energy transition plans as well. Economic crisis around the globe, and especially again in the developing Asia and developing Southeast Asia, is likely to stall a lot of commitment, a lot of government commitment to those climate and energy goals, because of perceived urgency of economic stimulus and job creation, and oftentimes it is urgent crisis of COVID that is of public health and economic that is have been recently and surely last year eclipsing any other long-term challenges such as climate change. But to be fair, Southeast Asia has, and now focusing more on energy, has been talking about those issues for a long time, even has an ASEAN plan for energy cooperation in place for 2016 to 2025. So this has been in place for some time, and detailed discussion and meeting have been happening throughout this time, even when US was not very sold on the idea. And we are actually now in the last phase of this plan. Now the issue is, and those are very comprehensive and ambitious plans, and of reducing energy intensity, having very aspirational targets to meet, having a good balanced energy mix, different portfolios and different sectors, tailored to very different Southeast Asian realities, individual countries, building capacities, technology, and policies. All of that is included. What I am worried is the implementation. And as I said, we are supposedly in the last phase of it. Now the monitoring and monitoring of those projects and ambitions might have been stalled a little bit, especially last year when both the whole region was under COVID crisis, and more recently, additional to that is the Myanmar crisis that also takes a lot of political energy of leaders away from other issues. So my worry is those agenda might be now considered a little bit secondary. So it's good that US is bringing this agenda back to the forefront at every meeting, and trying to lead with an example and leading in the discussion. I think how this, and just to wrap up in the remaining time I've got, is that how US, China, or any external partners can really affect the energy landscape in Southeast Asia. Again, I think we're coming back to setting standards. This is a region that has huge need of infrastructure. Ambassador Palmer just quoted as well. This is a region of developing. They will have a push to continue post-COVID, to return to the trajectory of economic growth. Almost every country's ambition right now is to come back to the GDP growth prior to COVID. So there's going to be push to go back to that economic growth fast trajectory. This is a region of young demographic, big population, fast urbanization, very energy hungry, with estimated, in trillions, if not more. And so it comes back to financing issue, climate financing and sustainable energy financing. And in financing, just like with other infrastructure, China has been doing quite well in Southeast Asia because of affordability, because of accessibility. The cheap solar, the cheap battery have already flooded the market. Is not something new either. So this is really something to be mindful of. I think if I could quote, Secretary Blinken recently said that, and I quote, "It's difficult to imagine US winning strategic competition with China if we cannot lead renewable energy revolution. Right now, we are falling behind." So this is end of the quote. This is what Secretary Blinken, I think there is certain recognition already in DC that it is going to be a long-term, but very essential aspect of competition. Now, there is also, I mentioned in the beginning, that is also a hopeful atmosphere, because I think there is one, if there is one clear area of cooperation between US and China, and then certainly Southeast Asia would want to see more cooperation between the two giants, is climate change. It is a collective, it's the global agenda, and we have to have EU there too, we have to have the rest of Indo-Pacific, everybody needs to play their part. China and US cooperation would be desirable, but again, coming back to the starting point, which is political will, I think it's quite challenging to cooperate where there is no trust. The big global agenda, I don't think anyone would oppose, whether China or US or any political view, but the details are, the devil's in details. It's really coming to, I think some of the panelists already mentioned the supply chain, as well as building innovation, cooperating in that, upgrading efficiency, and sharing best practices, which means might be also sharing IPs, which is very contentious at the moment. In terms of I think studies evaluating and implementing, that might be probably an easier target to strike between US and China now, just to start off with good political will. But what I would end up my presentation on, and on how US can contribute in Southeast Asia in particular, I would say that it needs to tailor its strategy to individual countries. We are having to do with 10 very different countries which have very different energy portfolios and are on different stages of their transitions. We've got an urban Singapore, we've got Indonesia and Vietnam, who the three of them came to the climate summit last month. They are in a very different stages of economic and technological transition. They have different goals. So I think in general, US should drive the agenda across the region, but individually it has to really tailor how it can assist individual countries to strive to their existing goals. I'll stop here because I think I passed my 7 or 8 minutes, but looking forward to the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Huong. That's excellent. Let's turn the floor to Mandira. Would like to make your remarks, please.
Thank you. Good morning and good afternoon. It's very humbling to be a part of this discussion and energy discussion, and the discussion is going on very interestingly. The destination that we aspire to reach is pretty much clear to all of us. We want energy and energy security and economic development at the cost of net zero carbon emission. And this is not just a country or region specific problem. It has become a global agenda where half of the world is gearing up for transition to renewable energy, and while half of the world is still struggling for basic energy needs. Worldwide, there is huge disparity in fossil consumption pattern, economic status, and also the renewable energy potential. If we specifically focus on Asian countries, the situation is quite different here. The intensity of environmental impact is lesser, while the urgency to economic development is huge. This part of the world is going to see huge developmental activities in next few decades, which means that energy consumption is going to increase alongside. And it is estimated that the energy consumption can grow by more than 50% in this region. And how will the growing energy demand gets fulfilled? This itself determines the path they are heading towards. And it makes no sense not to learn from the experiences of developed nations. And it makes absolutely no sense not to follow the same path that leads to alarming carbon emission. And this is there is no alternative rather than choosing renewables over fossils to fulfill our energy demand. Every nation needs to explore every possibilities to harness renewable energy, and it is also essential to understand that clean energy potential endowment is uneven across the region. And however, if we are aiming for carbon emission reduction, we need to expand our thoughts beyond the geographical barrier. And because here the concept of regional power system integration suits the most. When countries come to a single platform, it will overcome resource constraints that is there. For example, if in South Asian regions, India's 64 power percentage power still comes from thermal power, and coal consumption is also relatively high. Bangladesh has potential to generate power from solar PV system of 50 gigawatt, but it still has power deficiency and relies heavily on power import from India. Bhutan has 30 gigawatt of power potential, and Nepal has technically feasible hydropower potential of 43 gigawatt. But due to lack of enough storage and PRR type hydropower projects, Nepal still faces power deficiency mostly during dry season. And the peak demand and seasonal demand supply variation is very complementing in these countries, which makes the regional integration a win-win situation. As of now, India has only bilateral agreements with its neighboring countries, and if the multilateral trading arrangement can be done, this region can tap the complementarities in a better way. Also, it is possible to discover better prices for energy in the integrated market because due to the increased competition, which of course is helps economy, but also most importantly, the energy reliability and the problem of energy access can be helped to a greater extent. Nepal recently joined the Indian Power Exchange market few days back, and that is from May 1st, 2021. And Nepal is being able to draw power at very cheaper rate as compared to the bilateral agreement that these countries have been sharing. So this is an example that the regional sharing can be economical and but as a key enabler, complementing policy framework should be in place. Grid code regularity framework harmonization is very essential. And for example, Nepal has many projects involving FDI from different countries. And in future, if Nepal wishes to sell the surplus power to India during wet season, the recently published cross-border guidelines of India can cause problem because it doesn't allow Nepal to sell power generated from projects involving FDI from certain countries. And this kind of policy will be constrained to regional connectivity where the resource is very limited. Also, instead of investing in coal plants, it would be economical to build power transmission and distribution infrastructure to trade or exchange renewable energy. And furthermore, during this transition period, energy efficiency can also play a significant role. It helps to conserve energy, reduce energy expenses, and also reduce carbon emission all at once. So, so awareness generation, policy adjustment, and promoting and incentivizing investment in energy sector measures and appliances would be very much required for this. Um, and many developed nations have gained more expertise in clean energy technology over the period. They have done lots of research relating to energy efficiency. So if developing countries can adopt the best practices and transfer knowledge, skill, capacity, and technology to incorporate such kind of breakthroughs in the power into their power system, it would save few decades, and they can learn from the best practices. And there is nothing that coordination and cooperation does not help. And I believe that the climate change, climate goals, and energy goals can be attained through such collaborative efforts. Thank you.
Mike, you're muted.
Did it again. Let's turn to KUBO-san for some final remarks here.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you very much, Michael, for the kind of introduction to the session. Really appreciate the earlier speakers. Fascinating range of topics. First of all, Mr. Kamphausen and President of NBR, Ambassador Palmer, distinguished speakers and guests. Thank you very much for inviting ADB to this event. Ashley, thank you. And good morning from Asia. Good evening to many of you. I agree a lot with the previous speakers, and we only have 6 to 8 minutes, so I'll try not to repeat. Especially, I think Ambassador Palmer has set the scene and covered a range of topics. So I wanted to actually spend my time and focus on the big elephant in the room. Usually we say the elephant in the room that people don't talk about, but Ambassador actually kindly mentioned it at the beginning of her intervention, and that's existing coal power capacity. Audrey, if you can, yeah, I see the slides. And I'm just going to use a few slides to highlight this and draw your attention, and we can talk more in the Q&A session. This is really to stir a debate. So I don't think I need to really mention to this crowd, but all of us know that coal-fired power is the single largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. Globally, of course, there's land use emissions, but if you look at the percentage, it's really coal-fired power. And we have to do something about it. We talk about renewable energy. Michael said, in the scene setter talked about the energy trilemma. That's becoming easier now because renewable energy costs are coming down. However, we don't talk enough about existing capacity, and if we don't address it, we're not going to stay within the Paris Agreement targets. Now, one thing that we are talking with our developing country counterparts every day is about the very important inflection point that's coming in about 10 to 15 years. That is when, with the rate of price decline of renewable energy, it will become more expensive to run existing coal power. So that's a marginal cost of existing coal plants will be higher than the levelized cost of electricity from new renewable energy. So beyond that point, it makes no economic sense for the countries to keep running them. So, first of all, we are really having in-depth dialogue, trying to convince our counterparts that it certainly doesn't make sense to invest in new coal power plant today, but it also doesn't make sense to keep running a coal plant for another 20, 25 years. So we at ADB, especially focusing on Southeast Asia, we're now exploring an initiative called the Energy Transition Mechanism, or ETM. Some of you may have heard of it. It's been in the public domain. It's been promoted by Mr. Don Kanak. He's the chairman of the Prudential Financial Group. He was a former, I think, general manager of AIG. And by the way, in his capacity as a co-chair of the World Economic Forum, ASEAN Sustainable Development Investment Partnership, he put it out there about 3 years ago. There have been a lot of studies done by Rocky Mountain Institute, Carbon Tracker, and other think tanks, nonprofit and for-profit. But there hasn't been a real feasibility study focusing on a specific country. Everyone agrees it's a great idea, but we haven't really studied whether it will work or not. So right now we are doing feasibility work covering technical, financial, legal, policy dimensions in a few Southeast Asian countries with very high share of coal power. That's Indonesia and Philippines, and we're also going to look at Vietnam. And it's a public-private partnership. So it's trying to bring in different pots of money into a blended finance vehicle and incentivize the early closure of power plants. And subject to the feasibility being established and interest of both the fund contributor side and the developing countries, we could establish this hopefully next year in one country, but the model is replicable. So it can be applied to South Africa, for example, our very close development partners, the Agence France, which is a French development bank. They are discussing with South Africa right now, and we're having preliminary discussions with India and other countries, and that could really cut significant amounts of global GHG emissions. Audrey, could you move to the next slide, please? So that was a summary. Actually, you heard all of it, so maybe I can stop here, but I'll just try to illustrate that. So you can see the left-hand chart is the share of coal-fired power in the world, and then US and EU. You can see that the global average has stayed around 40%. US has come down significantly over the years. It's below 30%, 25 or 23% now, I think. But in Asia, it remains really high. You can see China, India, Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam. You know, some countries over 60%, but most over 50%. Of course, the scale is very different. In Southeast Asia, we're talking about 30 gigawatts for Indonesia, 20 for Vietnam, and 10 for Philippines. Whereas in the U.S. and China, it's in the hundreds. But still, the share is very high. That's why I said it's a replicable model. We need to make sure it works in one country, but then scale it up for other countries. Next slide, please. This one on the left-hand side, about the rapidly declining levelized cost of electricity. IEA publishes reports, 86% reduction. I think over the last 5 years or so for solar PV. The right-hand chart is something we don't talk about very often, especially the second arrow. That's an analysis by Carbon Tracker. It's not by us. This is the case of the Philippines. The right-hand arrow where it says 2028, that's the earliest point that the levelized cost of electricity of new renewable energy will be cheaper than the marginal cost of existing coal. That's based on a range of coal price assumptions. It does not include carbon pricing, by the way, just straight economics. That also does not include battery storage costs. So it's not apples to apples, just a disclaimer. But in an environment where there's enough grid capability to handle variability, if we compare straight, it could be as early as 2028. We are redoing the analysis to have an apples to apples comparison. And it could be anywhere between the next 10 to 15 years. So the key point is from both the climate perspective and also affordability that Michael mentioned earlier, and Ambassador mentioned, affordable power and reliable power. It just doesn't make sense beyond 15 years. Next slide, please. So the heart of the mechanism is this one, and I won't spend too much time. I'm happy to discuss it with anyone who's interested. This is a slide from Don Koenig that's been published. You can see the link below. The idea is that it's a bunch of public and private investors. They would contribute to a blended finance vehicle in the middle. So there's concessional money there. There's equity and debt component that would go into the ETM, Energy Transition Mechanism. There are two boxes there. You can see the orange, the Carbon Reduction Facility. By the way, it used to be called the Coal Retirement Facility, the same acronym, CRF, but some people thought that was too direct. And then the right-hand side, the green one, is Clean Energy Facility. So the CRF would actually acquire assets from existing coal plant owners. It could be a direct cash purchase, or it could be an asset contribution with an equivalent equity in return. So the original coal asset owners could be a shareholder in the CRF. It could also be synthetic, because there are many power plants, Huong probably knows this very well, but in Vietnam and Indonesia, for example, the SOEs, the state-owned enterprises, own the assets, and there are regulations really making it difficult for real asset transfer. In that case, it could be a synthetic transfer where the CRF provides a financial incentive for the owners to close the power plant sooner without a real asset transfer. But the point is, this orange, the CRF, uses the lower cost of funding, the blended finance vehicle, that would use financial arbitrage. So there's significant room. So let's say the original coal plant owners were expecting, and it depends on when they invested, but nowadays it could be just 7% return with such low interest rates. But at the time of investment, maybe they were expecting 10 to 14% return. But with the blended finance, we may only need 5% return. So with that gap, the plants do not have to operate another 30 years, 35 years. It can still get the expected return in 15, 20 years. And then on the other side, the clean energy facility is this is really targeting reliability of the power supply, and we're talking about a growing energy demand environment caused by COVID, but that will continue. So in the 10, 15 years that we are trying to accelerate the phase out of coal, the time will be spent to invest in clean energy capacity plus grid and storage, so that there's no disruption in the system, so it's reliable. And it's in the small font there on the right-hand side, but very important component is that it will have a just transition element. This is absolutely critical for developing countries, not just developing countries, for the world, because there are many workers affected, both in the resource side of the economy and also on the power plants. We need to take the time to reskill workers to the transitioned, the decarbonized world economy, and support communities. So there's a just transition technical assistance element. Next slide, which is the last one. I won't spend too much time. This is just an illustration, again, from Mr. Koenig. So each of those brown bars represent a particular coal power plant. Now, you can see that so this shows 7 power plants. In reality, there could be 20, 30, 50. The renewable energy investment, we always talk about crowding in private investment into renewable energy, but that can only be done at the margin between the base that's filled by coal and other thermal power and then the demand. But by using this blended finance vehicle and accelerating the phase out, and very importantly, you don't see any change from day one. So this removes the concern of the energy planners and system operators. Nothing changes from day one. Same people keep operating, just the ownership changes. But then it gradually shuts down early when it is feasible to do so. That can double, triple the space of investment for renewable energy. And that allows further crowding of private capital to come in. That's just a brief explanation of ETM. Again, we are doing the feasibility study right now. If anyone is interested, I'm happy to discuss later. So I'll pause there, hand it back to Michael, and happy to engage in a debate and answer any questions. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. That's a really fascinating concept. And the average age of the coal-fired power plant in Europe and the U.S. is what, 25 years, maybe longer. The average age of coal-fired power plants across Asia is like 11 years. So one of the real challenges that you're getting at here is, what do you do with this young coal-fired fleet that, by any estimate, is going to be operating for another 20 years. So this goes directly at that really tough challenge. I mean, we're seeing a lot of things that are slowing down the new build of coal today. Renewable costs coming down, et cetera, policy, financing drying up, all kinds of things. But this gets at a really interesting way at that bigger operating cost of coal problem. So, just one question before we open it. The investors in this would be pension funds, infrastructure funds, sovereign wealth funds. Is that what you're thinking in terms of the investment side of it?
Yeah. Yes, exactly. So for all the ones you mentioned, we are talking to right now, and then ESG investors. There are many of them. There's still questions because some European financial institutions, they have a binary stance on coal, even though this is explicitly trying to accelerate the retirement of coal. If their stance is binary, like coal or no coal, then it's not possible. But that's not a big chunk of that community right now. The key would be the concessionary pot, and that would need public sponsors, and we're talking about scaling up to at least 100 billion per year. The climate investment funds that you may know about already has a new investment window called the Accelerating Coal Transition Investment Program that's been approved. So that's one possibility, Green Climate Fund and others, but also philanthropies, because we have been talking to the climate investment leaders partnership. For example, in the summit 2 weeks ago, Mike Bloomberg announced a big initiative, and so each of these institutions have philanthropic arms, so they may contribute. So we're talking with many partners. Michael.
I think it's important to make it not philanthropic. It's just a good business decision.
Yes, absolutely.
It's a good place to park this massive financing tsunami that we have in the system today as we speak. So that's really, really interesting. We've only got a little bit of time left, and we have a couple of questions that I'd like to get out there. One of which is, if you could just, any of you speakers, Jane, maybe this first one would be more down your alley, but all the forecasts for Asian energy consumption include the likelihood of hydrocarbons being necessary in the energy mix at least out to 2050, even under the best of circumstances. So isn't LNG in that case an awfully good option in the meantime? And I think the punchline, do you think the U.S. may be making a strategic error by de-emphasizing LNG and leaving open a gap that will quickly be filled by others?
So I hope it's not a strategic error, but I do think that going after natural gas right away would be a premature move. I think, Asia has its own reality that's different from Europe. So the idea, and there are other, mini economies that I'll be happy to fill in. But I just wanted to quickly note that the 4 years that we emphasize, or the United States emphasize, a lot of U.S. natural gas exports. I think there was also initiative to work with regional governments, financial institutions, public financial institutions to facilitate investment into infrastructure, because some of these economies do not have enough infrastructure, import, LNG import terminals, etc. I think the outcome was rather mixed. There wasn't like huge amount just kept going into the infrastructure. So even the years that there was political priority on U.S. natural gas export, perhaps the commodity as natural gas as commodity went there, but I think there wasn't as much investment into infrastructure. So I think there is still a lot of sort of a review of what didn't work out, what are some of the issues. But I do think that I would think that it's a little too premature to just all of a sudden go after public financing for natural gas infrastructure development and gas exports right at the moment for Indo-Pacific.
Yeah, I worry that there's a lack of reality in the U.S. and amongst the environmental climate community in Europe and the U.S. to, the reality out there. So, I guess, good question. There was one other question I'll try to get out. Maybe I guess Jane, is the U.S. Considering joining the International Solar Alliance under the new Biden administration?
Yeah, I saw that question. I actually am not familiar. I don't know. I think probably Ambassador Palmer would have been the right person, whether there is a plan underway. But no, I do not have the answer to that.
Well, we'll take it under advisement, as they say.
But just a quick comment on gas, if I may.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, this is a very important question, and Jane, thanks for bringing that up. We get this all the time from our developing country counterparts, like, okay, you're telling us it's not a good investment, to look at coal, but what about gas? Actually, we had the special President Envoy John Kerry participate in. We have an annual meeting, by the way, of the governors going on this week in ADB, and there was a session on climate change, and he actually, it's not a complete withdrawal. He said it's that what is strongly being recommended, suggested, is to avoid lock-in of gas, lock-in of GHG emissions from gas longer than what's necessary. UK has not explicitly brought up stopping gas finance, but also mentioned about a strict filter so that we have a transition plan. The reality is that there are many developing countries and also financiers and sponsors saying that gas is a transition fuel. But if you look at that particular grid, it's very clear that gas is being used to complement coal. To address as a load follower or the peaker, so it's a false argument in some cases. That's why we need to look at the situation, make sure that there are real plans to scale up variable renewable energy, and then it's time bound because the technology will be there, and there's so much investment in hydrogen. A lot of the natural gas infrastructure can be transitioned with upgrades, of course. So just that addition on gas. It's not a 0 or 100, not a black and white question.
Yeah. And I think there are a lot of issues about reducing the greenhouse gas intensity of the gas supply chain, the LNG supply chain, which a lot of people who don't understand the industry and all that don't appreciate the potential for reducing the GHG intensity of that supply chain. Another element to look at there. I try to bring my panels in on time and under budget, and we are at our 6:30, pretty close to our 6:30 end time. I guess at this point. Ashley, would you like to take over, or Roy? But I'll just say thank you to the panelists. We're running a little bit short of time to have a good But a good panel is always the one where you get to the really fun stuff, right? As you're at the end and you want to keep going. So I guess that's a good sign. So, but with that, thank you to the panelists, and I'll turn the floor back to Ashley or Roy.
Thank you, Mike. And again, thank you to all of our panelists. We never have enough time as we navigate all of this, and I really appreciate you all joining, because I know we are Zoom fatigue, WebEx fatigue is something that we all are grappling with over the course of this past year. But I found that to be very interesting, and I know there's a lot of questions as we look forward going ahead. But I think Mandira, as she opened up her remarks, the destination is clear, and I think we all have a pretty good idea of where we want to be. It's just kind of all that important content in the middle of how we actually get there. I know that is not a minor issue, but I again look forward to working with all of you on this. And again, to our speakers, thank you for your insights in framing all these questions that we'll ask over the next few days, and for really giving us a great kickoff to the rest of the remaining 3 panels. With that, I will say I hope you all can join us tomorrow morning, and we'll have 2 more great sessions. Well, morning Eastern time, evening to some of our colleagues in Asia, and really look forward to some of those conversations as we dig into some of the market questions and some of those harmonization questions as well. And finally, again, thank you to all of our participants for joining, and to Ambassador Palmer for kicking us off on this series. We look forward to, again, working with everybody and all the different stakeholder groups here.